You better buckle up, Buttercup, because I'm about to tell you about my best reading month of 2025 so far. In May, the aim of the game was to catch up. I'd fallen behind on my TBR a little bit because I've been traveling in April, so I was intending to make up for the little bit less that I read that month by reading extra in May and catching up on the backlog of books that I had on my TBR, which I didn't manage to do that. But because of a particularly hefty episode of Shelve It or Scrap It, some particularly thick book club books, and just generally making a conscious effort to try and catch up, I did end up making May my best reading month of 2025 so far. Not through the amount of books that I read though. I actually read the most books so far this year in March, but I did manage to read more pages than I have any other month this year so far. So while we're talking about numbers, let us get into those sweet statistics. So in May, I read a total of 10 books, which added up to 4,979 pages and broke down to an average of 161 pages per day. And yes, I am mad that I did not manage to get that extra 21 pages to tip us over 5,000 pages for May. For the star ratings, I had a long string of 3 stars. I had 6 3 stars. 4 of these were in a row. I had 3 4 stars and 1 5 star, breaking down to an average of 3.5 stars per book. For the demographics, I read 8 adult books and 2 young adult. For the formats, I was genuinely shocked by this. I listened to 4 audiobooks, read 4 ebooks, 1 ARC and 1 standard formatted novel. This indicates that I wasn't reading books that I own or books that were actually on my TBR. I was just borrowing them from Libby and reading them on my Kindle. So it makes it like I've read a lot of ebooks. Like most of the books I read were digital, which is wild. I don't think this has ever happened before. For the genres, I read 5 fantasy books, 2 romance, 1 fantasy romance, 1 mystery and 1 thriller. And then finally for the places where I sourced these books from, 3 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2025. 3 were books I received from the publisher, 2 are books that I have hauled in 2025, and 2 books were borrowed from either the library or Libby, with me not owning a physical copy at all. So the first book that I read was indeed a library book. It was Towers of Midnight by Robert Jordan. I think I read about 200-300 pages of this book in April, but I did read the majority of it in May in preparation for a live show, and I'm now currently 500 pages into book 14. This is book 13 in the Wheel of Time series. I'm now 400 to 500 pages into book 14 for the live show, the final Wheel of Time long live show on the 8th of June. So if you guys are unfamiliar with Wheel of Time, it is a very long, very substantial adult epic fantasy series that tells of a classic struggle between the forces of light and dark. The premise of this world is that the same events happen in each age, and as the wheel turns, the same events unfold over and over again. There are, however, a handful of people who are able to alter the pattern of events that happen every age, one of which, the most influential, is the Dragon Reborn, who is a figure that is kind of reincarnated. And we also have a handful of Tarvaren, who are people who are also able to alter the pattern and the weave of the world. And in this series, we are following this age's Dragon Reborn, who is hopefully going to tip the world away from the dark and towards the side of light for good. Now, book 13, the penultimate book in this series, I was actually a little bit disappointed by. Book 12 has been my favorite of the recent books that I read, which is the first book that Brandon Sanderson wrote. If you didn't know, Robert Jordan passed away while he was writing Wheel of Time, and so Brandon Sanderson took over and he finished out the series and wrote the last 3 books using Robert Jordan's notes and guidelines that he'd left. The thing that disappointed me about book 13 is a kind of an issue with the storytelling up until this point, because this book had to wrap up all of the plot lines that were unresolved that came before, and that included revisiting plot lines that we hadn't really touched upon since book 4 or 5, and that was incredibly frustrating for me. I feel like this should have been a very satisfying book because we were getting answers to some of the questions that we'd had for a very long time. We were getting resolutions to things that had been left open-ended for such a long time, but I felt like it was all crammed into this one book. And I mean, it has to be because the next book's the last book. And let me tell you, I'm 50% nearly of the way through that, and it is pretty much just a battle, or like a series of battles, but it is like back-to-back fighting consistently throughout that entire book. So Brandon Sanderson had a lot to wrap up in this one, and it just felt like a little bit convenient that everyone was tying up all of the loose ends that they had to and putting everything in place to go into this like endless fight that they're about to start fighting. And I mean, it's not like I'm a great lover of this series. I find it to be very tedious, very repetitive within the writing, although I do feel like the basis of the story is a strong one, and there are some very good moments throughout this series. I just don't necessarily think it's worth slogging through the rest just to get to them. But I was very disappointed by this one because I feel like book 12 was a very strong installment with some great plot twists and some dynamic scenes, and this one kind of felt like, not a prologue obviously because it's book 13, but it felt like the first half of the final book, and everyone was kind of just preparing, so I don't feel like anything really came to a head. Nothing was all that climactic. We didn't really get many reveals that I felt blew me away like we did in book 12, and I think especially off the back of book 12 and how dynamic it was towards the end, I was expecting something a little bit punchier from book 13, and sadly I did not get that. So I do think that book 12 is going to be the high point of this series for me, based on my feelings of book 14 so far, as well as how I didn't really enjoy this one as much as I anticipated. So I didn't have the best time with this, and I gave it 3 stars, which is kind of expected. I've given most of the books 3 stars in the Wheel of Time series, but I am glad that this one is almost over, and I am glad that I read this series just so that I can see its effect upon the fantasy genre as a whole since it was published. I then read Neon Gods by Katie Robert. So this one is the first book in the Dark Olympus series. If you guys are unfamiliar with Katie Robert, I'm not sure if all of her romances are BDSM, but all of the ones that I've read from her are BDSM, very smutty romances. I would actually say that Katie Robert is an erotica author more than she is a romance author, just because the focus is so centered on the smut. It's very explicit and it does deal heavily with kings. But this one in particular is the first book in a series of Greek myth retellings, with this one following Hades and Persephone. Now, I can't tell you if this is a fantasy romance or a contemporary romance. The Wicked Villains series, which I have read from Katie Robert before, is a contemporary romance. That one is a series of Disney retellings, but shipping the villain of the Disney story with the heroine or the hero, depending on the tale. That one is solely contemporary. There's no fantastical elements. This one is very similar in that it is a contemporary fantasy in that it is set in a city. It is ruled by Zeus, and then over the other side of a bridge you have the underworld that is ruled by Hades. Now, nobody knows that Hades exists. They think that he's actually died out and his line is non-existent anymore, because the title of like Hades, Zeus, Hera, Hermes are all actually titles, not the names of the characters. So they are ones that are either inherited or granted to people who are going to fulfill the role within this city's infrastructure. Now, Persephone, against her wishes, without anybody warning her, is to be married to Zeus, and she does not like Zeus. She doesn't want her fate decided for her anyway, but she especially does not want to marry Zeus. So she runs away to the underworld accidentally. Like, Zeus's men are kind of like chasing her throughout the city, and to get away from them she ends up escaping across the bridge, where she discovers that Hades is real, and they strike up a bargain so that Hades can get revenge on Zeus for the death of his parents, and so that Persephone can escape the fate of being forcibly married to Zeus. They agree to essentially fake date to put Zeus off Persephone, because she'll then be like damaged goods, while Hades also gets his revenge. So the reason why I'm unsure whether it's contemporary or fantastical is there's just a couple of elements in here that are very briefly touched upon and never brought up again or explained. Like, people say that crossing the bridge between the regular city and the underworld feels weird. Like, you have a feeling, it's difficult, you have to like push through it. And then I'm pretty sure in one scene in this book, Persephone says that Hades' tattoos move. That is it. Those are the only weird elements that we have in here. So I would kind of say it's a contemporary romance, but then that did leave me a little bit confused about those elements because they're not especially relevant to anything and they're never really touched upon again. In terms of my enjoyment of this one, I do think that this is the best Katie Robert book that I've read. It had a little bit more plot than the books in the Wicked Villain series did. to, and I was a little bit more interested in it because of that. There was also a little bit more of a slow burn in this one. It didn't go straight into the smut like some of the Katie Robert books I've read in the past have done, which is my preference. Like, I don't mind smutty books, but I prefer like 1 to 3 smutty scenes with a slow burn kind of like build up to it, whereas Katie Robert tends to be much more frequently throughout the course of the book. But this one did have a little bit more of a slow build to it. It had more plot, but when the smut came in, the smut really did come in, and I did find myself skimming some of that towards the end. I did find it very compelling, and that is why it's probably one of my favorite, or is my favorite, Katie Robert book that I've read. However, I did give this 3 stars, and that is because Katie Robert, I think, is very, very good at what she does. If this book sounds interesting to you, if anything I've said about Katie Robert sounds interesting to you, then I would highly recommend that you go and pick up her books, because I think that in terms of it being a very smutty erotic novel, I think it's great, and I really enjoy her smut, even though some of the kinks throughout her books, like BDSM and sex clubs, are not something that I am drawn to when I'm picking up romance. Like, it's not really my thing. I think she does what she does incredibly well. However, I do think that there are a lot of similarities between her books and the character dynamics, and even the side characters in this book being similar to some of the side characters in the Wicked Villains series. Like, Hermes in this very much reminded me of Tink in Wicked Villains. So I feel like she is an author that does what she does very well, and she does the same kind of thing over and over again, which is fine if you love that thing. So Ali Hazelwood does a lot of the same character dynamics, a lot of the same types of romances over and over again, just rinse and repeat. And Ali Hazelwood is one of my favorite romance authors, so I eat it up even though it's the same kind of thing over and over again. I devour them. Whereas because Katie Robert isn't my thing, like, I like them but I don't love them, it becomes a little bit tedious for me. So if that is something that you think that you would enjoy, I think you'll have a great time blasting through Katie Robert books. But for me, I think I've read enough Katie Robert for now. Not to say that I would never read Katie Robert in the future. She's just not like an auto-buy author for me or anything. I then read my arc of The Devils by Jo Abercrombie, and I am sad to say that I did not love this one. This has a lot of glowing reviews right now. A lot of people are really loving this story. Unfortunately, it was not quite for me, and I'll explain why. So if you guys are unaware, I do have a epic fantasy book club called Catch Up Book Club, where we do read-alongs of epic fantasy series, specifically extended worlds. So worlds where there is more than one series set in the same world. Through 2023 and 2024, we did the First Law series by Jo Abercrombie, and there were things that I really liked about that series or that world, and things that I did not. So I was intrigued to read more from Jo Abercrombie to kind of finally decide how I felt about him as an author. And this being his 2025 release, I knew that it was going to be a book that was featured in a subscription box that I intended to receive. So I thought that this would be a good pick to finally decide how I felt about Jo Abercrombie. This one is following, I can't remember all of the characters, but you have like a monk, a knight, an elf, a werewolf, this like really skilled warrior woman, and the heir to a throne. And the monk has gone to the city thinking that he's going to get this like great promotion that is going to be really good for his like career as a like religious man, and he is tasked with escorting this lost princess to her throne with this congregation of demons. So like the elf, the werewolf, there's a vampire as well, are all set to protect her as they take her to like the seat of her crown. This is kind of like an ensemble cast expedition that has like, it's a found family kind of story, and you grow to love the characters throughout the course of this quest as they're transporting this princess. Some of them grow closer, they have like a lot of mishaps along the way, obstacles are constantly thrown into their path that they have to deal with, and this is definitely a character driven story where it's kind of like the plot is just a tool which highlights the characters in a way that makes you kind of fall in love with them a little bit as the story goes on. When I was reading the First Law series, I really loved the trilogies within that world. So I really liked the First Law trilogy and also the Age of Madness trilogy, and the standalones in the middle I did not love as much. So I did have high hopes for the Devils because I expected it kind of to be in the same vein as the series in the First Law world, but to me this kind of read like a standalone within the First Law world, specifically Best Served Cold, which is my least favorite of the full-length books that we read for First Law, unfortunately. I think that when Jo Abercrombie has a large cast of characters and he's trying to get into a relatively like fast-paced plot, I don't feel like the amount of time that we spend in between character introductions is enough for them to be fully established in my mind. Like, I prefer to have a little bit of a slower introduction, spend a little bit more time with characters before we're thrown into the plot. And this one, like I said, is like a fun kind of jaunt. So we do not know these characters for very long before we're thrown into battle scenes. And this has 3 or 4 acts in it, each one culminating in this big, like, epic, elaborate fight scene. And I think that just the parts of this book added up to something that I didn't love. Like, it was a little bit too fast paced to me. It was a little bit too, like, battle focused. The characters were introduced a little bit too quickly for me to really truly appreciate them. That being said, the thing that I did really love about this was the characters. And by the time I got to the end of this book, even though I did not enjoy my reading experience throughout the majority of it, I did find that I was a little bit sad to say goodbye to the characters. Now, this is the first book in a series, so we are going to have more books following these characters. Sadly, I don't think I'm going to be reading them, but I do think that the characters were endeared to me by the end of the story. Something that I don't necessarily love about Joe Abercrombie as well is his humor. It's just not my type of humor. I like sarcasm, I like wit, I like puns. I don't really like slapstick humor or like body humor, and that is kind of what Joe Abercrombie leans into a little bit more. And I've said this before regarding something else, but I'm a serious person and I like serious books. And while the plot in itself sounds really good, the levity that Joe Abercrombie adds to the text with his writing is not my preference. So I think I have decided at this point that Joe Abercrombie is not for me. If you are yet to try Joe Abercrombie, I think that The Devils would be a great starting point, especially if you do like a fun, fast-paced plot. I also think that if you read the first Law and you really enjoyed it, especially those standalones, then you will really like The Devils. If you are a fan of Joe Abercrombie, I think you are going to love The Devils. But if you are somebody who, like me, read the first Law and you could take it or leave it, it wasn't a favourite, but there were parts that you enjoyed, I think that you would be okay skipping The Devils. I then read Sorcerer and Small Magics by Meg Ducey, which is a low stakes or like a personal stakes fantasy story. It is, I don't know if I would call it a romantasy, but a romantic plotline is a key part of this plot, and we are following 2 sorcerers who hate each other. Now, there are 2 different branches of magic you can go into in this world. One is writing spells and one is performing them. And much to his family's disappointment, our main character Leo is somebody who writes spells. He comes from a especially prestigious family of gifted sorcerers, and unfortunately that path is just not available to him. And honestly, he's fine with it. He's not that bothered. Because of his privilege and his upbringing, he doesn't take his education seriously. He's a little bit lazy with it, a little bit cavalier, which is a very different attitude to our other main character, Sebastian Grimm. Sebastian is from a poorer family, but he is an incredibly gifted sorcerer and he takes his work very, very seriously. So these 2 have never gotten on. However, because one of them writes spells, one of them performs spells, that is typically a duo that is put together. And for a class assignment at this like magic guild or university they attend, they have been put together. Sebastian performs what he thinks is one of Leo's spells, but it's actually a very powerful spell that has ended up mixed amongst Leo's things, and they end up performing forbidden magic that has Leo very closely tied to Sebastian. So much so that if they are physically separated, like, Leo cannot bear to be away from Sebastian. Now, obviously they hate each other, so they very quickly realize that they have to figure out a way to undo this, but they very quickly exhaust their resources, and so they have to travel to somewhere where they've heard there is a very reclusive and powerful sorcerer who may be able to undo the spell that Sebastian performed. So this one, I think if you're a fan of cozy fantasy, or if you are a fan of like cottagecore kind of stories, fairy tale-esque stories, quest stories where people kind of are going on a mission to achieve something and obstacles are thrown in their path, kind of like the plot structure of The Devils, but I do think you will really enjoy this one. I found it to be quite charming. I very much enjoyed the writing. I enjoyed the relationship between Sebastian and Leo throughout here, which, like I said, this is a romance, but through the most part, like, it's a very slow burn. It's a very slow build of them becoming friends before anything else kind of develops between them. And I did really like that and the relationship that they developed, and also the juxtaposition of their two attitudes, with Leo being a lot more like relaxed and easygoing and Sebastian being a lot more like moody and serious. And I also really liked the world building in here. I think Mega Ducey did a very good job, like Julie Leong did in The Teller of Small Fortunes, of making the world seem very well fleshed out and very well developed before the characters were put on the backdrop of it, which I think is something that is often not done very well when it comes to stories like this that are low stakes or that are cozy, because you don't need an expansive world if you're telling a small story, if that makes sense. So I do, as somebody who loves world building, I do appreciate when authors actually put the time in, because the world is often the thing that I'm most interested about when I'm going into a fantasy story. So it is always a plus for me. So I did have a good time with this one. It's just not really my kind of thing. I don't gravitate towards cozy fantasy. I would say that this is something I asked in my comments actually of the Shelf or Scrap It episode that I read this in, for what people are calling books that aren't quite cozy, because the stakes aren't incredibly low, but it's not like end of the world stuff that we're dealing with. And somebody said that people are calling it personal stakes fantasy. So essentially, if they don't resolve the plot of this book, it's going to be the end of the world for Leo, but it's not going to be the end of the actual world. Like, the rest of the world is going to be just fine. I'm typically more of a save the world kind of girly. Like, I want those epic plot lines with those really high stakes, and books like this I do find enjoyable to read. I listened to the audio of this and I read the entire thing pretty much in one day while I was working on my Patreon bookmarks, so I would definitely recommend going the audio route. I found it extremely enjoyable. Had a great time when I was listening to it, but this is not one that is going to stick with me at all. In a couple of months I probably won't remember very much about it, so I definitely think it's worth the try if anything about it sounds interesting to you, but it's not one that's going to stick with me for a long time, unfortunately, and I gave this one 3 stars. One that I kind of have mixed feelings about is The Drowned Woods by Emily Lloyd Jones. Now, this is one that I gave 4 stars to. It is more of a 3.5 though, because it is a story of 3 parts, and there was one part that I enjoyed significantly less than the others. But Emily Lloyd Jones is an author that I've kind of been resistant to trying for a long time, and it's just because her stories don't seem appealing to me at all. The synopses of them don't really draw me in, but she is an author that is often featured in subscription boxes, so I have had a couple of her books over the years. Now, this one in particular is about the last water diviner, and she as a child was taken in by the prince and essentially forced to use her power to aid his armies and aid his kingdom in a way that she didn't really understand the ramifications of until she was older. So she has run away, she's left the prince's service, and she has tried to live a life of peace up until she is hunted down by the prince's spy master, who allegedly is no longer affiliated to the prince and actually would like to weaken his hold on the kingdom. So he is putting together a task force of people to destroy the well that ties magic to the castle, like the city where the prince lives, and therefore weaken his power and weaken his hold. So he approaches our main character Mare, who is a water diviner. Obviously she is going to help them when it comes to the actual well. We also have another character in here who has been gifted powers by the fair folk where he can kill 7 people, so like with his touch or with a thought. And then we have a couple of other side characters, people who like know the layout of the city, which is actually the spy master, but people who have access to resources that is going to help them along the way and that kind of thing. And together they go along to this city to try and get rid of this prince who has hurt Mare and the spy master deeply. Now, this is a standalone and it isn't a very long book, and I feel like I say this all the time, when it comes to fantasy, standalones are not my preference. I would rather have a much longer, I would rather read a series Wheel of Time's length than read a standalone, because I feel like I enjoy the expansiveness of the story, the expansiveness of the world. Wheel of Time obviously is not a great example because I don't love it, but just as a comparison, like I'd rather get into something super intricate and expansive than a small fantasy standalone because I just prefer my fantasy to be more rather than less. And I did really get into the beginning of this because the way that it was written hinted at a more complex world and a more complex story that I knew we were going to be able to fit into the page count of this book. So I really like the atmosphere and the setting. It was reminiscent of things like Throne of Glass and the Realm of the Eldlings, or specifically like the Fitz books, the Farseer trilogy, in the setting that we kind of start off in. We then got into the second section of this book, which felt more like what I had been reading recently in terms of things like Sorcery of Small Magics and the Devils, where we were following a quest-based story where a group of characters are trying to achieve things and obstacles keep being thrown in their way. So it kind of lost my interest throughout the middle section, which I think was actually the biggest section of this book, unfortunately. However, everything changed at the end of that when we got some interesting plot twists, and the end of the book went in a direction that I didn't expect it to. Overall, my thoughts on this are very mixed. I do feel like it is going to go the same way as Sorcery and Small Magics, where it's something that's not going to stay in my mind, like I'm not going to think about this very often or retain it in my memory for very long. But I do think that it was a much more interesting story than I expected it to be. If you like standalone fantasy, if you like stories that weave mythology and lore into one like kind of easily digestible story that also has some really good writing, some really good atmosphere, then I would recommend picking up The Drowned Woods. I personally would have loved this to be, if it was going to be a standalone, at least another like 150 pages added on, so that I really became engrossed and embedded within the story, because I did feel like it was almost over before it had begun. That, like I said, is a personal preference with me when it comes to how I prefer to ingest fantasy stories. I then read my favourite books of the month, starting off with Highly Suspicious and Unfairly Cute by Talia Hibbert. So Talia Hibbert is the author of one of my favourite romance series, which is the Brown Sisters series, and this is one of her YA romances. I'm not sure she has more than this one, but I wanted to give it a try. I just didn't expect to have the level of attachment to it as I do the Brown Sisters series, with it being young adults, and I loved it. I don't have the same level of attachment as the Brown Sisters, but I still thoroughly enjoyed this, and I would recommend that you give it a try if you want a cute, easy, diverse young adult romance. So this one is following Bradley and Celine, who used to be best friends. However, Bradley had a little bit of a glow up when they were entering high school, and he became part of the popular crowd, and Celine feels like she has been left behind because she's a little bit weird. She's really into conspiracy theories, and I think she has a podcast about it, and she feels like Bradley left her behind because she was too weird and different to fit in with the popular crowd. So since then, they've kind of become enemies. However, they both end up on the same program to win a scholarship. Celine is looking to study law, I think like Cambridge or Oxford, and Bradley is also wanting to study law, but he's not quite as passionate about it as Celine is. So they end up working together through this scholarship program, which is actually kind of a survival course. It's not that intense, but it involves them going out into the woods and doing like a scavenger hunt and like navigating, like orienteering throughout the wilderness, and so they choose to work together. Something that I really appreciated about this is that it has OCD rep, because Bradley has OCD that forms a very prominent, recurring, like consistent part of his life that he has to navigate on a daily basis. And while I thought it was well represented throughout here, I can't speak on it, but I did find out when I got to the end in the acknowledgements that Talia Hibbert herself has OCD. So you are going to get a, I guess, like an accurate representation of OCD from Talia Hibbert's perspective in this book. And the reason why I appreciated it so much is that I don't think I have ever read a book about a character with OCD where that is not the point of the story. Like, this definitely influences Bradley's character. It influences his thought pattern, his day-to-day life, but it is not about him having OCD. It is about his relationship with Celine and also navigating his future, as he is about to go through this transitional period in his life where he is going from like high school and sixth form into university. This does have, as a lot of young adult contemporary stories do, some pop culture references, which I'm wondering how they are going to age in time. Celine, I can't remember if she does have a podcast actually, because I have just remembered that she has a TikTok account which is referenced kind of like consistently throughout here. And personal preference, like I don't love when books ground themselves in a specific time period. At this point, we don't know the longevity of TikTok. Do you remember when Facebook was like a big thing that everyone was on all of the time, and now like people barely use Facebook? So I don't love it when books do that, but that is me being kind of nitpicky, because otherwise I had absolutely no issues with this. I thought it was cute, it was compelling, it was a great time, a quick, easy read, and I think that if I was the target demographic for this book, it would have been a solid 5 out of 5 stars. As it is, I still thoroughly enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars and I would recommend it to people. It's just not one of my personal favorite books. I then read a book that broke me, which was my catch-up book club book, Ruin by John Gwynne. This one is the 3rd book in the Faithful and the Fallen series, which is an adult epic fantasy series set in a world where there was a war between giants and men in the history that has founded like the foundations of the myth and the lore and the history of this world. We are quite a few hundred years past this now, but there is a prophecy that originates from the time of giants that says that there is going to be a black sun and a bright star that rise. Like, these are going to be the avatars of good and bad and the representatives of the 2 gods in this world, and the entire world is going to split and unite behind one of them. We are going into this series is a series with a lot of character perspectives, so you follow a wide range of people throughout this world. You are going into this not knowing who the bright star and the black sun are. You know that you are following them in some capacity in one of the many character perspectives, whether that is a character with a perspective or a character that is observed by another character perspective, but you don't know which one is which, and the characters don't know which one is which either. But we are predominantly following a young boy called Corbin, who at the very start of this series is going through his warrior trials to become a man and reach like manhood in this society in a time of peace. But as we have things bubbling under the surface that are going to start to come to a head towards the end of the 1st book, which throws us into the turmoil that forms the basis of the rest of the series. So by book 3, we are really in the thick of it, and I would describe John Gwynne as a mix of like George R.R. Martin and Robin Hobb. So the story has the same kind of tone of Game of Thrones. It is a historical fantasy in that it is rooted in like British and Norse history like Game of Thrones is, although it is a very different time period with a lot of characters, but it is kind of written more in the style of like the Realm of the Elderlings, where it is a little bit more character driven and you form more attachments to the characters in this than I would say that you do in Game of Thrones. And on top of that, another comparison to Game of Thrones, absolutely nobody is safe in here. Absolutely nobody. And what I feel like this provides is a very dynamic, complex, interesting fantasy storyline, but with a level of emotional attachment that I don't always have when it comes to epic fantasy. And when nobody's safe, when the stakes are high, when you start to get the twists coming in, that is going to break you. And it definitely broke me in this one. Now, when I immediately finished this book, I had a very emotional response to it, which made me want to immediately give it 5 stars. However, I did settle on a 4 for this one because I think that the first half of the book was a little bit slow. The character perspectives we were getting were a little bit samey. This is like a book for the old guard, and the majority of the perspectives that we're following throughout the beginning of the book are the older warriors that form a part of this story. So the people who, this isn't like their first rodeo, like they have been to war before, they have been to battle before, they have fought before, they have had maybe not necessarily a great start in life and have had to like fight to get to where they are today. So we're not following the kids in this one, the ones who have just come of age and been thrown into this conflict. It's the people who have a little bit more experience, and they are some of my favorite characters, but I did feel like we had a very slow progression throughout the beginning of this book that led up to a dynamic ending. And one of the things actually that has been missing from the series for me up until this point is plot twists. So I had character attachment, which is integral in my favorite series. I had a very deep-rooted interest and investment in the plot, which is also integral, but I didn't have the twist. Like, it wasn't surprising me. Everything was playing out in ways that I found to be predictable up until this book, which blew my mind. Like, the main thing that we found out in this book, I did not even think could be a possibility. And I'm shocked, and I'm very excited to see how that plays out in the final book in this one, and the effect that this series has on the world, because this is our catch-up book club series and we only read more than one series set in the same world. So the next series is set in the same world but like a number of years after, but I believe that the events of that book are very much influenced by the end of this series. So I'm very, very excited to be reading book 4 in this series in July. Is my body and my heart ready? Cannot confirm. We then had my only 5-star of the month, which was actually just a little bit of a shock. It was The Boyfriend by Freida McFadden. I had not read a book by Freida McFadden before. I knew that she was a very popular and well-loved like mystery thriller author, but I didn't know anything about her past that. I knew that she was a very popular mystery and thriller author, but I had no knowledge of her past that. I had a suspicion that she wrote very compelling, very easily digestible stories, and I was definitely right. Aside from that, I didn't know why people loved Freida McFadden so much, and I do think that she is quite a polarizing author, if I'm being honest. There is no guarantee that I would love the rest of her books based on my enjoyment of this one, but this one was a great time. Now, I do feel like I need to preface this by saying I am not really a thriller reader, and when I am a thriller reader, I read purely for enjoyment. Like, I'm not critiquing this book, I'm not really diving into it. It's just based on how compelled I was at the time that I was reading, because if I'm picking up a thriller, it's because I want to read something where I cannot put it down. I just want to consume the entire thing in one sitting and have an amazing time, and Freida McFadden delivered that for me. And like, if you watch my vlog where I read this, for most of this book I was like, I don't understand what's special about this, because this seems to be playing out exactly the way that you would expect it to, laid out in the synopsis. And then when I got to the plot twist, I was out walking Brie, I listened to the audio of this, which definitely would recommend. I gasped. I audibly gasped when I found out what the plot twist was in this book. So this one is following a woman who has not had a lot of luck dating, and after a especially terrible date where her date will not take no for an answer, she meets this guy outside of her apartment building who intervenes and diffuses the situation, and she thinks he's amazing, but she's a little bit shaken, so she goes back to her apartment building, and when she's talking with her friends, one of her friends who's just come off a date with this guy that she's been dating and is like obsessed with because he's so perfect, she decides that this guy that she saw outside of her building was a missed connection. So she starts to try and figure out who he was so they can reconnect. Now, in the midst of this, she forgets all about this perfect man because her friend is murdered. The police think that the person who is responsible for the murder of her friend is this guy who is known to date women before he kills them. So this woman, who has literally, she's honestly never met a red flag in her life. She's colorblind. She does not know how to see them. And she meets this guy that she saw outside her apartment building once again, and they start dating. However, he seems just a little bit too perfect to be true. And throughout the course of the book, like, she starts to get a little bit more suspicious about him. Meanwhile, we are also following this guy's perspective when he is a teenager, and he is infatuated with this girl in his school called Daisy, who is the daughter of the police chief, and he thinks she is absolutely stunning. He finds her captivating, and he also wants to kill her. So we are following our main character in the present timeline as she's dating this guy and recovering from the death of her friend who was brutally murdered, and we're also following this guy's perspective in the past as he is dating this girl in high school and trying to resist the urge to kill her. So it seems pretty clear cut, right? I thought that too, and I was wrong. I was a little bit annoyed when I was reading the first half of this series as well, because it very much felt like a rip-off of Joe Goldberg, which, if you guys don't know, You by Caroline Kepnes and Hidden Bodies, two of my favorite books. I'm a massive Joe Goldberg apologist, unseriously, obviously. But yeah, I felt like it was a little bit of a rip-off of You. But like I said, the plot twist blew my mind. I also, once again, don't want you guys to take my review and recommendation of this book super seriously. I'm not a thriller reviewer. I'm here for a good time. I want to be shocked. Like, I usually go into thrillers with really unrealistic expectations, which is to their detriment. I expect every thriller to have the best plot twist ever that I never even saw coming for a second. And often, like, some thrillers aren't about the plot twist. Their focus is elsewhere, and some of them, obviously, like, I'm somebody, as you may have noticed, when I read fantasy, like, I really read into it and try to predict what's coming, and I can't shut that side of my brain off when I read thrillers, so sometimes they don't surprise me at all. But that is my primary goal going into a thriller, what I expect, whether that's unrealistic or not, and this was a thriller that actually fulfilled that for me. I'm not saying it's going to fulfill that for you, but it did for me, and that's why I gave it 5 stars. I then finished out the month with a couple of sequels. The first one one was Burned by Sarah Shepherd, which is book 12 in the Pretty Little Liars series. This is another series. It's once again a mystery series. I really love young adult mysteries and thrillers. I don't really like old-timey murder mysteries in general, but young adult modern mysteries or thrillers, and also young adult contemporary fantasy that has like an occult or like spooky witchy twist is my sweet spot when it comes to young adult fiction these days. So the Pretty Little Liars series I have been reading as like an unofficial buddy read with my patrons, and we are up to book 12. I actually should have also read book 13 in May, but we're not going to talk about that. But essentially, even though this series has gone a little bit downhill, like the last 4 books I've read have not been quite as good as the first 8, I'm still having a great time. So if you are unfamiliar with the Pretty Little Liars series, it is about a group of girls whose friend went missing a couple of years prior to the start of the series. They have drifted apart since this because she was the glue that was holding them together. However, they have to come back together when they start to receive a series of threatening text messages from somebody who signs off as A to try and get to the bottom of who is blackmailing them. Book 12 I gave 3 stars to. Definitely not one of my favorites in the series, but it was still entertaining, compelling, and did exactly what I like this series to do for me. Like, it was just a good time. My issue in terms of the actual plot and the story of this series at this point is that through books 1 to 8, which were supposed to be, they were the original intended series, you have 2 story arcs there, the first 4 books and the second 4 books, where there is like a thread of a plot that goes through those 4 that culminates at the end of the 4th and the 8th book. And it feels better plotted than these books do, because realistically I should have just reached the end of a story arc at the end of book 12, but I feel like when this series was renewed for like an extra 8 books, which I think the 9th book came out the year that the TV show started, so it is probably like connected there, but I feel like Sarah Shepherd did not have a tight plot in mind, and it feels a little bit all over the place. A lot of the plot of these last 4 books has hinged on something that happened when they were on like spring break in between books 8 and 9, and they keep referring back to, especially in the first couple of books, like that thing that happened that nobody wants to talk about, and it feels like that was invented to give the series a reason to carry on. But also this thing that happened, while it is like the thing that happened is like a big deal, it just doesn't feel real, not realistic. It just feels weird. Like it doesn't feel like a realistic progression, I guess, of the original story. And because it doesn't feel like that, it doesn't feel well grounded within like the world of this series, I'm finding like I have a little bit of a lack of attachment to these later books. And something that actually annoys me the most about them is that in every single book of the last 4, they think the new person is A. It's just whoever happens to be around them at the time. So it's not grounded in any kind of reality in terms of like what happened in the previous books. It's like, oh well, this person goes to our school, so theoretically they could have done this. And it's like, so could anyone who went to your school. You're only bullying this person right now because they're the person who's literally right next to you. And the person that they suspected in book 11 actually was literally ridiculous. I was like, you are reaching so bad. So yeah, I'm still having a good time with this series. It's just the plot is not as strong as it has been in the past. So for that reason, I only gave this one 3 stars because I still liked it. It just wasn't as strong as previous books. And then the final book that I read was Lady of Ashes by Melissa K. Roerich. This one is for my actual Patreon book club, which is like Catch Up Book Club, but we read fantasy romance series instead of epic fantasy. And right now we are reading the Lady of Darkness series by Melissa K. Roerich, which is one that I've heard great things about. So this one is very similar to Throne of Glass. It's very similar to a lot, like all of Sarah J. Maas's books in different ways, but the setup of the plot is very similar to Throne of Glass. We are following a girl who is an assassin raised by the assassin lord, and she has become estranged from him after the death of one of her friends. She needs some time to recuperate before she goes back to work, and the assassin lord is not willing to wait any longer. He wants her back in the fold right now, and so he offers her a job that she cannot resist, because upon completing this job he will give her access to the Fey Fire Lord who is responsible for the murder of her mother. So she agrees. Obviously we have a bunch of complications along the way, and it is a romance, so we have a romantic plotline that develops there as well. So in book 3 I had a lot of difficulty getting through it, if I'm being honest, and this series is very similar to Sarah J. Maas in a lot of ways. Like book 1 was very reminiscent of Throne of Glass, book 2 was very reminiscent of A Court of Mist and Fury, book 3 started to introduce plot points that I have seen in like the second and third book of the Crescent City series. So it's very similar to all of these different elements of Sarah J Maas, which is why I kind of consistently give the books in this series 3 stars, because I feel like it's not unique enough for me to kind of rate any higher. But one thing this series has always been up until this point is compulsively readable, and I really struggled throughout the first 60 to 70% of this one because I found it to be very repetitive and all of the characters were behaving in the same way, which was really annoying me. Everyone was posturing, everyone was threatening to fight anybody else. Every time somebody new walked into the room and found out the plot developments, they were just like ready to throw down, and I was getting so tired of it. The only plus for the beginning of this book is that the main character was not as insufferable as she usually is because of circumstances. And if you've read the book, you'll know what those circumstances are. So it's not even like she changed as a person, it's just given the circumstances, she obviously wasn't being as annoying as usual. I do feel like an issue with why I don't have a great attachment to this series is because I feel like I don't really love the attitudes of the characters. They do all think that they're badasses and all they want to do is show everybody else how much of a badass they are, like literally all of the time. The romance, it's not a romance that I'm like willing to die on a hill for, but like I enjoy it. Generally, the strength of this series to me is how kind of familiar it feels within the kind of story that it is, and also the writing. So I genuinely enjoy the reading process of it usually, but the plot and stuff is obviously something I've seen before, and the character like archetypes I've definitely seen before. So the fact that this one was so hard to get through meant that it was a real struggle for me, but it annoyed me even more because the last 15% of this book was like 5-star material. It was so dynamic, we had cinematic fight scenes, we had some cool plot twists and betrayals, and I thought that the last 15% was incredible. The only criticism I have of the end of this book is that throughout like the last 2 chapters, we see the main character doing things from the perspective of other characters that it's kind of related to, and I feel like I would really have appreciated the focus of the story being on things like that, because we don't even see her doing things. Like, we just see other people's reaction to them, and I think that that was such a shame, considering there was so much repetition within the first half of the book, which was just the main character and the love interest passing like cheesy romantic catchphrases back and forth, when I want the focus to be on like the cool fantasy stuff that she's doing. Like, I want to know how she's doing it. I don't understand how she did the things that she did, and that's what I would have liked to see instead of what we actually got throughout the majority of this book. So yeah, it wasn't a great one. I gave it 3 stars. Essentially it was a 2 up until I read the end, and that really like elevated the story for me. The good thing about the end of this book being so good is that I am now not dreading going into book 4 as I was originally. I'm actually a little bit excited to kind of like see how things develop going into book 4, but book 3 was not a great time for me, if I'm being honest. So that pretty much covers all of the books that I read in the month of May. Down in my comments, let me know whether you've read any of these and which one was your particular favorite. But if you have not read any of these ones, then let me know what your favorite book that you read in May was. And of course, if you guys would like to let me know that you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, then please leave me a purple emoji for Queen of Ashes by Melissa K. Rorich. But that is about it for my May TBR. I'm hoping for a similar outcome from June. I don't know if we're going to get one, if I'm being honest. I'm trying to be a little bit more relaxed because I read 5 of these books in 1 week in May and it was intense. And I'm trying not to have to get to that point, but still making a conscious effort to get through the books on my TBR that I didn't manage to get to in May, as well as all of the stuff that's been added obviously for my June TBR in general. But we'll see how June unfolds. So please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you will find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, and my Patreon if you would like to follow me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.